Welcome to the 2018 to 2019 NCFCA webinar series. The goal of NCFCA webinars is to facilitate a platform where thought leaders and subject matter experts can provide insight on topics relevant to current debate resolutions and speech events. Our desire is to provide a platform that encourages mentorship, real-life application, and competitive excellence. Our intention for this webinar series is to help provide educational context for the debate topic from a variety of different viewpoints. Please keep this framework in mind as you craft your questions and take advantage of the fact that you have an opportunity to interact with someone who can provide insight from their unique perspective regarding the debate topic of fair trade versus free trade. The format for this evening's webinar will begin with a 30-minute presentation from our guest speaker, Chris Solt, and will be followed by a giveaway segment. Our giveaway this evening is provided by the Bill of Rights Institute, and the giveaway is going to be a copy of the book, What's Wrong with Protectionism? Answering Common Objections to Free Trade by Pierre Lemieux. The giveaway, as I said, is hosted by the Bill of Rights Institute, which is an educational nonprofit located just outside of Washington, D.C. BRI engages, educates, and empowers individuals with a passion for the freedom and opportunity that exist in a free society. They envision a society in which all individuals enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness so that students can engage with and champion these rights for themselves and others. This giveaway is going to be determined based on our students' engagement, so please do submit questions using the Q&A function available at the bottom of your screen, because after the presentation and giveaway, we will be moving into a 15-minute live Q&A during which our NCFCA host, Ravi Paul, and our guest speaker, Chris Solt, will respond to the questions that you've submitted in a conversational interview style. If you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out via the chat function, and our tech support team will be here to help you enjoy tonight's presentation. So at this point, it is my honor to invite our NCFCA host, Ravi Paul, to join us here on screen as I introduce him to you this evening. Dr. Paul is an associate professor of management information systems in the College of Business at East Carolina University. He earned both his master's and PhD in industrial management from Clemson University after completing his bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering from Bangalore University. He is also an NCFCA parent, debate coach, and member of our debate committee, and so we're thrilled to have him here with us this evening. Thank you so much, Ravi.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you for the introduction. It is my honor, pleasure, to introduce and welcome Mr. Chris Solt this evening. A little bit about Chris. As Executive Director, Chris manages the strategic, administrative, and programmatic aspects of the Fair Trade Federation. He also researches, develops, and implements Fair Trade Federation's comprehensive educational programs. He facilitates peer mentoring programs and drives and coordinates content for member events. Chris has dedicated much of his professional career towards strengthening fair trade businesses and advancing the goals of the larger fair trade movement. Prior to joining the FTF staff in 2016, Chris spent over 5 years as a regional sales manager for 10,000 Villages USA, working with fair trade stores of all sizes to be more successful. Chris then led the training team with 10,000 Villages for 7 years, which included coordinating and driving educational events, conferences, and fair trade promotion. After joining the FTF in early 2016, Chris has helped shape member education programs, led the coordination and planning for FTF conferences, and represented FTF at gift shows and events across the US and Canada. He has developed relationships with fair trade professionals from all over the world, including travels to India and to Nepal, where he saw the impact of fair trade firsthand. In July 2017, he became the executive director of FTF. Chris earned a BA in social science at Cleveland State University and a master's degree in organizational leadership with a graduate certificate in human resources from Southern New Hampshire University. Chris welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm really, truly honored to be a part of this. I was so delighted to get the invitation. When I saw the slide for and the theme for NCFCA, communicating truth and transforming culture, I said, wow, these are definitely my people. Also, I definitely love to be in front of young, smart people, because your future is my future, and so I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I'm hoping that you're seeing my screen here. Let me just make sure.
We're not seeing it yet, Chris, so you should have an option to hit share at the bottom of your screen.
There we go.
Perfect. Yep.
Okay. Yes. So wonderful. Let's see here. Get this. There we go. Excellent. Now I can advance my slides. So a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the Fair Trade Federation, which I am very privileged to be a part of. It's one organization in the larger fair trade movement. And then I want to talk about it's in the context of the larger, just to talk a little bit about who we are and what our organization is, and then talk about what is fair trade, and then talk a little bit about my kind of experience and dealing with the concept of fair trade versus free trade, and then give you some very specific opinions that I have and I have observed in my travels and professional experience. The Fair Trade Federation is a community of businesses committed to fair trade in everything they do. Hopefully, I'm hoping that you have been introduced to one of these organizations. This is just a selection of amongst 250 organizations in the US and Canada that have committed very deeply at the core of their DNA to fair trade in everything that they do. My first experience with fair trade was, it'll still date me a little bit, but 1996, I was traveling from Montreal to Cleveland I stopped in Niagara-on-the-Lake and went into a 10,000 Villages store and discovered fair trade, and I've been kind of very devoted since then. So, what is fair trade? Now, I'm curious if you all think about the very first time that you were introduced to fair trade, or maybe you're not even familiar. I think this group probably has a high likelihood that you've been introduced at some point. The most common is either coffee or chocolate. Those are the kind of usual entry level products to the concept of what fair trade is. And I'd say that some people from that discover a whole other world. So think about what you define as fair trade. When you think about fair trade, what does it mean to you? If you were all in one room and I was on the other side of the doors, the exit of that room, and each of you exited and closed the door and then told me what your definition of fair trade was, I have a feeling that you would likely all give me very similar responses. But they'd have probably a lot of different elements to them, whether it's women's empowerment or no child labor or fair wage or environmentally friendly, whatever it might be, you'd all probably get pretty close. Now that's really great, right? So my opinion is that fair trade is what we should be doing a lot more of globally. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's also a challenge because it's complex, right? We're talking about supply chains, and supply chains are very complex. But when you think about fair, right, we're all taught at some point what is fair. Think about when you're in kindergarten, the playground, what is fair? Kids really know what's fair, I'd say, often a lot more than adults. So that part of it is very simple. So it's also a challenge for the fair trade movement generally is what does fair trade mean and what is it, how can you participate and how can you make good choices? And that part is very complex. We'll talk more about that in a sec. So back to what is fair trade? The Fair Trade Federation has used this definition: a trading partnership based on dialogue, transparency, respect that seeks greater equity in international trade, not equality, but equity in international trade. And it contributes to sustainable development, specifically now in the modern context, connecting this trade practice to the Sustainable Development Goals, if you're familiar with that, by offering better trading conditions to and securing the rights of marginalized producers and workers, especially in the Global South. Now, this definition was codified by kind of a European consortium in 1998. Since then, it has been adopted globally by the World Fair Trade Organization and the Fair Trade International. And they came up with a charter, which I'll talk about in a sec. So the Fair Trade Federation uses this definition. Now, within that definition, there's many principles. There are 10 that the Fair Trade Federation and the World Fair Trade Organization use. The Fair Trade Federation principles we've created using the global principles of the World Fair Trade Organization as our foundation. The Fair Trade Federation and the World Fair Trade Organization recognize and uphold each other's principles and work together as allied organizations to promote greater equity in international trade. But we definitely share one key thing, as I mentioned, that fair trade is in the DNA of these organizations. They work closely with small farmers and artisans to ensure good wages, safe working conditions, environmental responsibility, and economic growth. And Fair Trade Federation members are screened and verified based on all of these principles to uphold the highest standards of fair trade business practice. That's this community's approach of 250 businesses in the US and Canada. The Fair Trade Charter, as I mentioned, is kind of like, of all of these complex things that I've been mentioning about the different aspects of fair trade in a complex supply chain, it tries to define how the global fair trade movement works together to transform trade in order to achieve justice, equity, and sustainability for people and planet. Probably something you've all heard of, people and planet. Asserts and that justice and sustainable development should be at the heart of trade structures. So rising inequality, entrenched poverty, and a deepening ecological crisis have mobilized the global community to seek new models of business and trade that drive fair and sustainable economies. Over many decades, the fair trade movement has developed and implemented a range of models that serve as an experiment in transforming the broader global economy. The new International Fair Trade Charter enshrines the common vision and fundamental values of the fair trade movement to put us on the path to realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. I definitely recommend you looking those up, and we'll talk about that maybe in the conversation after. Rising inequality, entrenched poverty, and deepening ecological crises have led the global community to seek new business of trade that drive fair and sustaining economies. With diverse actors playing actively in the global fair trade movement, the Charter serves as a single international reference point for fair trade, as I mentioned. So, from the Fair Trade Charter, how fair trade is realized in the marketplace has two different layers, and this is getting a little bit into the micro about the fair trade movement. As I mentioned, some of you probably were introduced to fair trade via coffee and chocolate. Those are certifiers. Some of you might have bought a gift at a small gift store and it said fair trade, or if you're familiar with 10,000 Villages, they are prevalent in the United States. That is not really able to be certified. If you think about a supply chain and all of the different points of contact and all of the different, thousands of different items that can be in a fair trade gift store. That's pretty challenging. So the Fair Trade Charter says that there are two different ways to enact fair trade. One is through membership model of verification. So it's a holistic evaluation of the entire business model. Those fair trade enterprises that is at their DNA, everything they do internationally and domestically. It's designed to incorporate different types of production, but it's really rooted in the handmade process, because if you think about okay, so let's talk about fair trade coffee, right? So that is a commodity that has one kind of direction of a supply chain. It's grown, it's harvested, processed in one place, and it's shipped, and there's one kind of line that it takes. Now with handmade items, so you think about jewelry and personal accessories and home decor, those all have many, many different paths and are very complex. So this model works very well for handmade products. This model also focuses on all of the fair trade principles. As I mentioned, the Fair Trade Federation and the World Fair Trade Organization. The other way the Fair Trade Charter works is through certification, as I mentioned. It's really in-person audits of work sites. It's designed for agricultural products with that one single line, and it focuses primarily on labor and pricing, because there's a standard coffee price, there's the global market price for coffee, and premiums can be put on top of it. That's something we can get into later, or I would recommend researching more. So Fair Trade International is kind of the green and blue yin yang, and then Fair for Life. These are, I don't mean to say that certification or verification is better or not than each other. All great work. It's just they are differentiated because of the types of supply chains that they are. So thank you for bearing with me on that. So let's move on to, how does fair trade differ from free trade? So I'm pretty biased on this, and I also represent an organization, so this part is really much more from the Fair Trade Federation community perspective. But I believe in this also personally. I'll share some personal thoughts and opinions in a bit. So free trade, and the FTF and Fair Trade Federation has defined it as conventional trade, has played a major role in countries' trade policies for the past few decades. It is very, very different. It's just on two different ends of the spectrum from where I sit. So Fair Trade Federation has talked about fair trade using 360 degrees as its own approach, which is kind of like, if you think about the cyclical nature of a partnership that goes back and forth, where you're constantly in touch directly with the source of that supply chain, rather than an extractive model, which has many points of contact and everyone taking and extracting value along the way, referred to as middlemen, historically. It really is been important for the Fair Trade Federation to differentiate itself even within the fair trade community, that it's very important to them that it's recognized they are really a very high bar, and there are deep long-term partnerships. So just to dive right into this, the main goal of free trade, and this is our perspective, it's to increase nations' economic growth. And it's really, quite honestly, in theory, it's pure capitalism. Our fair trade model the main goal is to empower marginalized people to improve the quality of their lives. There's a reason why that is a goal. If you think about our global colonialist history, why is there such deep inequality in the world? We'll revisit that. So free trade focuses on trade policies between countries, right? If you've studied international trade or just read international news, you know that trade policy is kind of a hot button. But these are all between, really countries. And if you think about who's running countries, those tend to be the establishment, the 1%, if you want to define it that way. They tend to be people very disconnected from those who are human people with their hands making the shoes that they wear, the clothes that they wear, the food that they eat. That disconnection is very apparent with free trade. It really is a written by government approach. Fair trade focuses on commerce between individuals and businesses. I have been to India. I spent 2.5 weeks there, and then we were in Nepal for a week and a half, and we visited probably 25 different workshops that regularly had contact with buyers, fair trade buyers. They knew their names, they knew their families, they knew their children. And when you make business decisions that directly impact somebody that you think about things differently than when you're buying from a broker, right? Some of them never even meet each other. It's all done online and done at lightning speed. It's quite a different approach. Major actions, countries, lower tariffs, quotas, and regulatory barriers to trade. That's the theory. It doesn't really work out in real life, depending on your perspective. In a fair trade, businesses work in partnership with artisans and farmers to ensure favorable financing, a living wage, and higher labor and environmental standards. Now, favorable financing, I think, is underselling some of the things that I've seen done on a regular basis with some astoundingly unique and very equitable fair trade work. 50%, think about this. If you're a business student, think about how crazy it would be to pay 50% of the order. Let's just say it's $100,000 US. You pay $50,000 in upfront. Now that might sound really crazy, but think about the impact that might have on an artisan workshop that is in a location that were they to go to, if they even could have access to capital, the predatory terms are so incredible that often in India and Nepal, and I know in Laos and Vietnam, people get into these cycles of debt and basically become indentured servants and basically to debtors just to try to buy raw materials and pay their workers to produce an order, right? So paying 50% up front allows them to buy the materials, pay their workers, and it transfers the risk because of this global inequality, which I think is key to always keep in our minds, that allows them to then build their business so that they're not going into a cycle which is unfortunately all too common in the developing world. So that's just one example. I just wanted to point out that favorable financing doesn't really do that concept justice. So free trade creates change through market and government policies, right? Now, those don't necessarily work if you've studied the history of NAFTA and corn dumping, which we can talk more about in a bit. It's all in the matter of how things are actually realized in real life. Fair trade creates change through living wage and community improvement costs. The certifiers actually do great work, and they pay a premium. So they work with, pay a fair price and a fair price, and then they have this extra premium that's put on top of what the workers make, and then the workers get to decide for themselves how that premium is spent. Some of them are development projects, some of them are education projects, some of them are agricultural experimentation to build capacity. They're really innovative stuff that's happening. Now, free trade primarily benefits corporations and businesses, right? It's a profit-taking model. Their shareholders to report to, who export and import in participating countries, right? Fair trade, the beneficiaries are small-scale farmers and artisans who lack economic and social opportunity. But I will admit, right, there's a lot of great people in the US and Canada and all over the world doing great work that's equitable and sustainable in long-term partnership with people working respectfully, that everyone makes money, right? Because it's not, the charity model is not what this is about, where, you know, I buy this thing and this starving person gets X, right? That's not what this is. This is trade, right? With dignity, not charity. Supply chain, I hope I'm not like going for, I get really excited about this topic and I go on and on. So I see that I'm at 27 minutes here, so I'll wrap up pretty soon. So the supply chain with free trade, so it's very complex. I mean, fair trade supply chains are complex, but it's more, it depends on the type of craft or commodity that you're working on. It's not complex because of all of the humans along the way extracting value that make it complex. It's all, free trade is guided by trade policies and agreements, right? So we've heard about the TPP, we've heard about NAFTA. We could talk about those if we want. And fair trade, we're guided by fair trade principles. Okay, I promised I would be done by 7:30, so I got 2 minutes, my own arbitrary deadline. So this is kind of like my personal opinions and assertions and experience about free or conventional trade. So, you know, honestly, the term really is irritating to me. Free trade sounds really nice, right? But the reality is that free trade is anything but free, right? Think about who pays the true cost of a supply chain, right? If there are chocolate companies that have used, and some still do use, you know, chocolate that has been harvested by child slaves. That's been documented. There's, I can send all of you some resources and links, and I know we'll get to that in a sec, but there's a really amazing documentary about chocolate and the use of child slaves in the harvesting and processing of chocolate. So, you know, if you think about free trade, that's possible with a free trade agreement, right? But it just doesn't, it doesn't make sense to me to call it free trade when that can occur. Somebody's always paying, right? The inequality creates a disparate value, and that's in fair trades, I'd say globally, opinion, it's not right. It's also not sustainable. You know, that product often comes at the cost of someone's dignity, health, and long-term well-being. So I could talk a lot about that. So another thing about, in my opinion, about free trade is that it ignores yet simultaneously exploits, right, the realities of global inequality caused by a history of colonialism and racism and so on. It's also based on an extractive model that feeds further inequality. And as I mentioned, you know, not adding value, but extracting value. It doesn't bring all stakeholders to the table, right? Think about all of the business decisions that are made in, you know, developed countries in Europe and United States, Canada, that have vast impacts on people working in factories and their lives. If you've heard of and remember the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh, where all those thousands of people died in one factory. All those decisions are made somewhere far away. None of those people were invited to the table. It's not really hard to like do a survey monkey, right? And say, hey, at minimum, to say, hey, you know, how are you doing? It's really basic, and that's pretty stark, I'd say, as a business model. At minimum, they're not at least even heard. And, you know, it prioritizes profits over people. That's just, in my opinion, that's not sustainable. It fails to address the realities of climate change, and I underscored that and put in crisis, because it really is quite a crisis at this point. There is a company called Maggie's Organics, and it's incredible. Organic socks, fair trade cotton socks. They've had whole cotton plant, like farmers, and whole crops go completely fallow. They're no longer able to make cotton in some countries that they've worked with. So they've had to shift to other countries, literally completely wiped away. It is very real. It's a business reality. And when you're looking at business and trade from a profit model, that is often minimized. That's something that, as at, environmental sustainability is at the core of fair trade supply chains, and even our supply chains are being threatened by it. But we feel that we're often on the kind of cutting edge of sustainability. I can talk for a long time about that. And then free trade doesn't address subsidies and dumping and doing things and cheating, which countries do, and they subsidize a certain crop and then they dump it in another country, and then that whole industry goes under, like what was done with NAFTA, and corn, and Mexican farmers losing basically their shirt. Okay, so obviously I was challenged to keep to 7:30, and it's a complex topic. Obviously, I'm very excited about this topic and get really passionate about it. I will just let you know, if you want to visit our website, fairtradefederation.org, we will send you, I was talking to the organizers, Robbie and Natalia, and we'll send a lot of different resources. There are so many other things that I feel is really germane to this topic, which we'll provide afterwards. Consider signing up for a newsletter. Just one more invitation before I give it back to Robbie. We have a conference every year, and it's always fun and exciting, and there's lots of education and lots of networking. Our organization is turning 25 years old next year, and we're celebrating in Austin, Texas. So you're all welcome, and I'll stop. I promise that's the only plug I will do. So that's what I have, and I look forward to your questions and talking more.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really wonderful. We so appreciate you giving of your time and sharing from your unique perspective with the Fair Trade Federation. I know we have questions pouring in over here, over 100 questions from students. So lots to talk about in just a couple of minutes in the Q&A with Ravi here. But before that, we want to go to our giveaway from the Bill of Rights this evening. Again, that's going to be the book, What's Wrong with Protectionism? Answering Common Objections to Free Trade by Pierre Lemieux. And the two winners of this book are Ava Allen and Peter Montgomery. Ava Allen and Peter Montgomery, congratulations. Thank you for all of your fantastic questions that you submitted this evening. If you both could send us your email address via the private chat, that will go directly to us on the back end as panelists, and we will make sure to connect you with the Bill of Rights so that you can receive your giveaway. So thank you all, and thank you again to the Bill of Rights for connecting us with Chris and for providing this book this evening. So with that, let's go ahead and just do a brief review of some of the opportunities that we have for webinars for the remainder of October. So on this Monday, October 22nd, we'll be having our next TP webinar hosted by Patrick Henry College. President Colonel Middleton will be joining us on Monday to give some insight into the team policy resolution. And then on the 25th, Patrick Henry College will be joining us again, and President Hay from PHC will be presenting on the apologetics topics, talking about presuppositions and worldviews and how that all ties into your work for apologetics if you're competing in that this season. So I encourage you to sign up for that if you have not already, and we will go ahead and drop the sign up links for that into the chat so that you can reference those, click the links, save them for after this event so that you can sign up if you haven't already. But with those quick announcements, let's now go back to Ravi and Chris and to the many questions that you all submitted. And we really look forward to having a fantastic conversation that is helpful to you for competition this season.
Thank you, Natalia. Indeed, we do have a ton of questions. Your talk certainly has provoked a lot of questions, Chris. That's wonderful. We have a lot of participation. So to sort of hopefully maximize the use of our limited time here, I am going to try and group some together and try and address questions that I think are really on top of our participants' minds, and we'll see how far we get. So
absolutely.
Yeah, so the first one I want to ask you is, and I'm sure you receive a lot of these questions, but fair trade, when we talk about fair trade, when we hear about fair trade, it seems to be, most of the talk seems to be talking about developing countries. Can you talk about how fair trade works among developed countries?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. And it's actually really insightful that you mentioned that, because there's obviously multiple layers, but it's a topic that actually has come up historically in several ways. One has been someone's introduced to fair trade, and you talk about the concepts of a fair wage, right? Access to markets, economic opportunity, empowering marginalized people. You think, well, in some cases, hey, that's your uncle in Appalachia or a Native American reservation, right? So there's that concept of, well, why historically, fair trade has been geographically about from the global north, right? Importing from the global south. That's been the kind of historic model, right? Increasingly, with more awareness about Native American and First Nations peoples, their marginalization, that's not really getting better for them. Like you think about Rohingya, refugees, Syrian refugees, the refugee crisis in Europe, refugees in the United States. Thinking about, the original concept of why would we do this crazy thing called fair trade, right? Why are we trying to work in a specific way? It's really because there are people that are economically marginalized for whatever reason, not by their own fault, but because we think about, there's this amazing group called Silence, and they're right outside Calcutta, and they work with women who are former sex workers exclusively, and like that organization, and they give them education, healthcare, and then job training, and then they literally are working, producing. It is a transformative experience for someone who, by no fault of their own, like for whatever reason, it is marginalized. That is, that's kind of extraordinary. And the same aspects and same characteristics that someone in that situation could be a Somali refugee in Seattle, Washington, for example. I know there's a group there. And you think about marginalized, okay, that person didn't want to leave his home, right? But he's in this situation because usually, when you think about refugees, that's because they're feared for their life. So rather than for them to just be a burden on an NGO or charity or whatever, give them access to make their own life. And so just because they are geographically in the North is something that the World Fair Trade Organization just voted into their code of practice, that those people who are not geographically in the North, but in essence economically and socially marginalized, are included in the fair trade model. And that is something that the Fair Trade Federation, because we work closely with them, are going to be incorporating in some way into our practices this coming year. So that's kind of one lens that it's working. And I'm assuming that's kind of what the question was.
Yeah.
I could, domestic fair trade or trade from the global North, as far as, trade in the United States and Canada in particular. I'm assuming the question wasn't really about those practices necessarily. I'm hoping that was got to the part of it.
Yeah, we might get to that in a little bit, but thank you. That was good. It certainly addressed some of that question. So I'm sure you've heard this, Chris, many times. With free trade, money flows between individuals, between businesses, between nations, and it goes from consumers to producers. You look at I talk about, I'm very familiar with supply chains, and there's tremendous opportunity and value in providing what many would consider fair, as far as getting the lowest possible price to the consumer by taking advantage of economies of scale and villages in China dealing with their specialty and therefore bringing that to bear on the ultimate price and keeping it affordable and so on and so forth. On the free trade side of the equation, what would you say is why in fair trade you seem to be talking about money mostly going from consumers to producers? Why is the latter more important?
Why is the money going from?
Why is the model with fair trade, where you're saying those that are producing should get a equal wage, even if it means that the cost to the consumers are going to be greater? Why is that?
Yeah, so
yeah,
that is a question that I get a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Right? It's usually framed in like, well, why is it worth paying more, right? Well, honestly, in some rare cases, in some agricultural products like bananas, maybe pineapples sometimes, depending on the global trading price, I actually think that's a misnomer, that there is a premium to consumers, right? Because you think about, it's still, fair trade companies or fair trade enterprises are still working in a price-taking market, right? So somebody's going to ascribe some type of value to a product, and they're going to say, I'm willing to pay that, right? You think about the full package of what they're wanting to purchase. That is a very complex thing. And I know from, I'm sure you could teach me a lot about that in being a business professor, but like the psychology of that says that, people are looking for more than just, the best price. Now that's not everyone, right? So it's the way that consumers can express their values in the marketplace. Saying that, yes, I want a good price, but I don't want to price, like, what's the tipping point for you? And this is, I don't have the answer, but there is somebody's tipping point in their own personal values and ethics and the way that they interact with the world economically and otherwise, saying like, well, I can buy a $3 shirt from Walmart and there, I win, I get the best price. But if that $3 comes at the cost of somebody's environment and dignity, some people are looking for a way to do that doesn't harm the person at the other end. I think it's that. Price definitely is an equation, but it's not the only. And that's what I think is the kind of what I wanted to answer your question to. It's not just price. It's not just a one transaction. it's the way in which I express my values, the way I want to see the world.
Okay, that's excellent. Very good. I that's well put. I understand what you're saying, and absolutely, value is determined by the buyer, the consumer, ultimately, and it is sort of in the eyes of the beholder, and you know, what things that they value and what they consider valuable. That's great. And so my understanding is that you know, the Fair Trade Federation is sort of trying to, because what you're talking about is not all consumers. It's a specialized group of consumers that are looking for different values to determine their perceived value for a product or service, right? And you're trying to connect them. So Chris, sort of a jump, but a very important jump from what our debaters are going to be thinking about and working on. Has any government implemented fair trade? And if not, what are some ideas that you could propose for a government to actually implement fair trade practices?
Yeah, I can't, off the top of my head, I think it's Scotland. You know, so fair trade is like far ahead in some ways in the EU, particularly the UK and you know, a lot of the Western European countries, including a Trade Fair, Live Fair campaign that the EU actually awarded. I think it was like 11 million euros to 20 some odd EU nations to promote fair trade generally. There are, so I love your question. I hope I got that right, but I can supply the links to everyone that's on this webinar afterwards, as far as there's Fair Trade Towns International, and Fair Trade Towns is a way that I think there's 1,000 some odd towns all through Europe and the United States that have dedicated themselves to a set of principles and practices, like having a certain amount of fair trade products available in your cities and your country, even, or there's fair trade workplaces. So that's kind of one approach. There are some things in the EU Parliament that are happening. I mean, the Fair Trade Charter was adopted, but in the United States, I'd say it's a little bit more challenging at this point, both politically and economically. Just back to one thing you were saying about, you know, Fair Trade Federation products, it's like a specific kind of demographic. We kind of hope that we feel like when people understand the core value of fair trade, then they're kind of a convert. Now, obviously, you can't buy a fair trade Toyota Corolla. Right. You can buy a fair trade iPhone. So those things have challenging aspects of them just by their supply chains and their components. But we'd like to think that eventually, you know, there would be a much more demand, because that's what the market is saying. It's also using terms like ethically traded, or ethical fashion is a huge one right now. So we're trying to figure out how do we fit in and how do we partner with those movements, because they have very similar values as well. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Chris, would you expand a little bit more on you mentioned the EU Charter. Is that like a binding, some kind of a policy, or what is it?
Yeah, the Fair Trade Charter, it's really a kind of it's not like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Like that is much, it's more binding, although, you know, there are countries that just thumb their noses at it, you know, quite blatantly, but it's more aspirational. It's also because, you know, one of the challenges with fair trade is that it is not easy necessarily to explain, right? Because our consumer culture is such a short attention span, right? We've been trained to like label good, Whole Foods, yes, or whatever it might be. Like it's very challenging in a very saturated marketplace to get a complex message out, especially I just went on and on for 20 minutes and I barely even scratched the surface because I feel very passionately. So like, you know, to try to connect to a consumer in that setting with a limited time frame and shelf space and all that stuff is very, very challenging. So, so yeah, that's an ongoing challenge.
Okay. And so would you say, I really like that. I think that's the key idea that you propose is it's aspirational. It's governments trying to build policies, develop to get to a place where they could maybe partner with fair trade organizations. And then maybe do you see eventually policies that dictate or drive?
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah. So, okay. As soon as you get into that, just my experience in conversations like we had. So the World Social Forum is a giant social activist forum. Tens of thousands of social activists come from all over the world every 2 years. The last one was summer of 2016 in Montreal, and we had a big, huge conversation about governments and policy and fair trade. And most of the fair trade players were very cautious about that. Look at what happened to organic, okay? So organic through the 80s and 90s was, you know, there were different standards, right? There was the California organic, and they were like way up here as far as their standards and purity or however they defined all their criteria. And then there was like Hain, Dole, the large, you know, multinational agro businesses that saw this increasing demand for organic as people started to think about, you know, chemicals and pesticides, and they started to, organic became a thing, right? Hain and Dole, they wanted the bar to be here, and the federal government came in, the USDA came in and said, okay, it's here. And so the California organics were not happy because they basically felt their standard was diluted. And then the kind of the big multinationals, they didn't like it, although they have the resources to get there. You know, it's arguable if they got there and there was a long timeline, and you know, once you get into the details, it gets more complex. So from that experience with what happened to organic, which is a very allied movement, organic and fair trade, right? Organic and fair trade is a lot in common and cross over a lot in different supply chains. Because of that, there is a kind of a discomfort, at least, with governments coming in and setting that policy. Because, you know, once you know, we just see the history of governments doing that. It has to be somewhat of a more aspirational, but I don't really have the answer for that, because when governments actually put trade policy in place, it's imperfect, to say the least.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Great. Thank you, Chris. So can you share with us a couple of maybe success stories that you're familiar with, as far as, you know, how this, I mean, you've already talked about a couple of examples, and any if that comes to mind specifically that is closer to the government partnership oriented or government sort of connection, even remotely connected to governments.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk about. Yeah,
absolutely. So yeah, fantastic. That's not as much my expertise, but because there's different political realities in the U.S., there's much less like the way in which that usually is manifested is through procurement, right? You get governments, municipalities to put in their, like, you know, their purchasing guidelines for uniforms, or they only buy fair trade coffee for their functions and their government offices. Much more prevalent in Canada, and we're in both United States and Canada. And a friend of mine is the head of the Canadian Fair Trade Network, and they work because the Canadian government is much more favorable to equitable trading and sustainability, and you know, the Canadian Fair Trade Network works very closely with a lot of governments, different local, regional, national, to try to get more fair trade policies built in. And they actually just, trying to remember that I was at a conference last March in Vancouver, and they're trying to get a joint proposal for an anti-slave policy as far as procurement. Any company that they have to demonstrate that they use zero slave workers of any kind. Adult slavery is a huge issue, and that's something that fair trade supply chains very specifically work against, and actually provide opportunities for those coming out of that multi-billion-dollar industry globally. So anyway, so that's a few examples of some really great work happening.
Okay. Yeah. In your opinion, have you come across? I'm sorry, I got distracted. I saw something, and
okay.
I have all these windows open, and I'm seeing all these things coming by. Any weaknesses from your perspective on the fair trade side?
Yeah, unfortunately, absolutely. So there's several different layers of it. One, you've already gathered that it is complex to explain. It's complex to communicate in a concise way in the marketplace. That's what our organization continues to struggle with. Expanding market share, right? That's whether you grow demand or you grow supply, but I don't think there's really not a shortage of supply, really, unfortunately, depending on the type of product, right? And a lot of the product in our membership, in our organizations, is all handmade. So there is a kind of a law of diminishing returns at a certain capacity. But then we've got organizations like, Dr. Bronner's. If you probably have seen their soaps and personal care products in stores, they're in Target and other stores. They have no shortage. So it's just, and they're quite a large company. But they do a lot of great things. Like they have a 5-to-1 executive to entry-level worker pay ratio cap. They do what they call constructive capitalism. I recommend researching them. But so I have to get back to the weaknesses. That consumer confusion is a huge weakness. I'll just be real frank with everyone that fair trade has had a lot of challenges. There's some players that there's a kind of a spectrum, right? Fair trade certifiers have kind of not agreed about different standards, and I won't get into all the specifics about it because you can certainly research it. But whether or not factories are included, if it's a factory premium and conditions, or if it needs to be small farmer focused only, all the different labels. Just walk through Whole Foods. Walk through Whole Foods and the snacks and the chocolate. You'll see all different types of things. In the fashion industry, what's right, as I mentioned, ethical fashion. So West Elm is starting to use like fair trade and ethical, and it's a larger company. They're doing great work. It's challenging, at least within the kind of fair trade bubble in that world, is those that have built fair trade in their DNA. It actually affects their cost of goods. It affects their margins. It affects their whole organizational business capacity to grow and to market itself. That is challenging to be using the same concept of fair trade as someone who, like a Starbucks, has a fair trade coffee, certified coffee, right? So they can, that tends to be housed in the marketing department. It's much more akin to like a corporate social responsibility approach. I'm not bemoaning it, but they're using the same kind of moniker and concept as someone like 10,000 Villages, who does everything in a fair trade manner. So that is a challenge, I'd say. And then just climate change supersedes everything else. Climate change is affecting people, supply chains, businesses, farmers. I can't underscore how much that is a factor and will be increasingly in the future. And not just coffee and chocolate. You know, if you were to, you know, there's some theories of like looking at, if you look at coffee rust, there's this coffee rust that is decimating coffee plants. At the same time, the global fair trade coffee price is so low, it's so bizarre. So like fair trade coffee is, a lot of it goes unsold. There's a lot of challenges which are really all emanating from the climate crisis that is going on right now. Cotton is another. So yeah, I'd say that's probably the thing that keeps me up more than the kind of approach and how we talk to ourselves, talk about, you know, what we do to the consumers. It's more climate change. That's the biggest weakness right now.
Okay. So yeah, we're almost out of time here, Chris.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I appreciate you taking the time. Although your last statement, can you maybe just take coffee as a specific product and just expand on that argument that you're making about climate change? In other words, why is coffee grown through fair trade, not impacting climate change, while it would be under free trade?
Actually, I apologize. That's not what I meant. It was all coffee is being impacted by climate change.
Okay. I understood. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm sorry. You were asking about the weakness of fair trade, as opposed to free trade. Yeah.
Okay.
But I'd say, yeah, it's a challenge for all businesses, really.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, I was a little confused.
Sorry about that.
I thought I'd missed something. It's possible I missed a lot, but anyway, thank you so very much. I appreciate you taking the time to be here. Thank you for sharing your not only your experience and expertise, but also your passion for this, Chris. Very, very much appreciated. So thanks again.
You're very welcome. It was such an honor and privilege to be here, and I promise to send a lot of resources and links, some videos and some links to some great organizations if you want to learn more about this topic.
Yeah,
and they can give you a lot more concrete data that is beyond my expertise.
Wonderful. Thank you. Natalia is going to come and I think wrap it up for us here.
Okay.
Natalia.
Yes, thank you so much, Robbie and Chris. That was a fantastic conversation. Thank you again to all of our students, parents, and coaches who joined us this evening and asked fantastic questions. We're thankful for all of you. And as Chris mentioned, we are going to be sending a follow-up email to all who registered for this live event. That email is going to include links to the different resources that Chris referenced, as well as some additional videos and documents that he thinks will be helpful in your research. So we'll be sending that out to those who have registered for this live event, together with a link to the recording of this for those who are not able to join us this evening. So with that, if you have any questions, feel free to email us. The email address is office@ncfca.org, and we'll get back with you. And we hope you have a wonderful evening as you continue to do your research, prepare for this competitive season. And we look forward to communicating truth and transforming culture with all of you this year.